You've probably heard of the MIT morality test. If you haven't, it is a test involving a hypothetical situation where an AI car that's brakes have failed must make a decision on whether or not to kill the passengers. I was wondering how a programmer would go about this kind of morality situation, and my conclusion was that we would derive some kind of algorithm to determine whether to save the passengers or the pedestrians in a given situation. So that's exactly what I did. I'm going to run through the formula and why I picked the variables that I picked, how I came to these conclusions, and then I'm going to go through the test for myself. Warning, this is just for educational entertainment purpose, and the entirety of this algorithm will be based entirely on my subjective views. We'll start off with something like this. So in our class, we have an array of passengers and an array of pedestrians. Additionally, we have the number of passengers and number of pedestrians. And lastly, we have a variable VOL, or value of life. Now let's formulate an algorithm to determine which value the car should steer toward. And what do we need for this? A for loop. Anyway, we can make a for loop that looks something like this. Now that we have a setup for our loop for passengers, let's start deriving some values. In this situation, we are given different circumstances: age, profession, gender, level of fitness. This is, however, assuming the individuals are human. So before analyzing any of these, we got to make an if statement for whether or not they are human. Now we can analyze these four standards. This is where subjectivity comes in. You may have the belief that age is more important than profession, or level of fitness is more important than age. This is just generally how I see it. I personally will rank them in order of age, profession, level of fitness, and lastly gender, giving them respectively multipliers of 2, 1.6, 1.4, and 1. The most empirical measurement I can use for all of these is CALIES, or quality adjusted life years. Assuming generally that the old person is in their 60s, having them about 12 years to live if we take average life expectancy into play, and that the normal person is approximately 30, leaving them about 32, and that the child is maybe 12, leaving them about 60. Arston et al. In 2002 claims mental deterioration begins at around age 70, so CALIES for the old person would be around 10, for the average person it would be around 30, and for the child it would be around 58. If we write it out, it should be something like this. Again, this system is heavily biased, but these are my personal moral values, so they're reflected in my algorithm. Anyway, next we move on to profession. Going with the assumption that an average person has kids and supports a 4-person nuclear household, if both them and their partner are around average age and their kids are younger, we have an accumulated value of 30 plus 30 plus 58 plus 58, equaling a staggering 176. This is the point where I realize these numbers are going to get a little ridiculous. You'll see what I mean. Doctors are a little easier. Online sources claim an average doctor has an impact of 600 CALIES in their lifetime. Assuming they too have a nuclear family, we can add to that CALIES and get them to an impressive 776, like I said. This is going to get messy because now we have the executive. Oh boy. We're going to make a lot of assumptions for this algorithm to work. So let's say the average executive supports a business that employs 100 people. Let's assume if the executive dies, the business fails, and all those people will be unemployed. The American Census Bureau claims that the average American is unemployed for about 21.6 weeks or 151.2 days. Multiply that by the number of employees, and you get 15,120 quality of life days disintegrating because of this executive's deaths. Now divide that by 365 for CALIES, and we get 41.4 CALIES, which I round down to 41. Let's also add the 176, assuming they also have the average 4-person nuclear family, and we get a total of 217. Now, look, my conclusion isn't that doctors are nearly 3 times more important than executives and 4 times as important as the average person, or even that executives are 50% more important than the average person. These are just measurements that I thought would be reasonable and somewhat represent my moral standing for the test. Anyway, lastly, we have homeless people. Assuming their age is equal to that of an average person and they most likely don't support a family, I'm going to half their CALIES left because I don't think their remaining years would be quote-unquote quality, and that's the best mathematical method I could think of. So after all that, we have something like this. After I made this part of the algorithm, I realized I slipped up. For the doctor and the average person, I determined the quality of life years provided by their existence, but for the executive, I calculated the quality of life years lost by their death. This doesn't really work, and for the sake of consistency, I had to recalculate the executives. So let's take 100 average employee assumption we had earlier and the assumption that the company is dependent on the executive being alive and create a new calculation. The average person will work in a company from 25 to 65, so about CALIES, and I know working at some corporations can cause quality of life to go down, but we are assuming a perfect world. Gainful employment adds quality of life. Anyway, so we simply multiply the 40 quality of life years by the 100 people, and we get 4,000. So this does not at all represent my moral standing, and I know it's consistent with the formula we use for the rest of the employments, but let's just go with the original because heavily favoring an executive to that level seems a bit extreme. No offense, executives. Next, we have level of fitness, but this one is a lot easier. I'm going to assume that being healthy simply adds 10 years to your life, and being unhealthy or large takes away 10. I know this might be a little extreme, but it also represents the amount of importance that I place on personal health and fitness, resulting in something like this. Finally, gender. This one is pretty simple. I'm going to add 75 if the female is not old because they have the potential to create new life, which adds 70, and 5 because on average, women live 5 quality years longer than men, and if it's an old lady, then only 5, which looks something like this. Lastly, we have to come back to the is humane Boolean, otherwise known as the true-false statement. Now, assuming the individual is not human, I'm going to average that a cat/dog lives for about 15 years for simplicity and add a multiplier of 20 because a pet can greatly increase the quality of life for potentially a whole family, and even with that, their value will only be 300, which is significantly less than a human regardless, but it at least acknowledges their presence. I don't have anything against dogs. I love my dog, but they live fewer quality of life years, and that's the metric we're using, and it aligns pretty proportionally with my system regardless. So the code would look something like this. Rinse and repeat for the pedestrians, and altogether the code would look like this. This obviously excludes the code for the pedestrians, which would be identical, except the passenger would be renamed to pedestrian. Also, keep in mind this code isn't runnable. It's just a visual educational example of generally how to program something like this. Think of it more like a pseudocode. You'd need to make another class and do much more to actually run this properly. Anyway, looking back at all this, you might be wondering why even use multipliers. If I was simply using quality of life, shouldn't I just add the quality of life years and the impact of the profession, the age, and the gender? The multipliers represent my importance of factor in the moral quandary and how I think the death of each person would affect society as a whole. Of course, entirely in my opinion. We actually have one more thing to do before we are done. The AI vehicle, in my opinion, should generally be designed to protect passengers first. However, I don't want to significantly sway the other concepts, so we'll add 100 to the passenger's total VOL, and in cases where there are no passengers, we'll compare them directly. The comparison code will look something like this. Keep in mind, it's pseudocode. I thought the formatting would be funny. Anyway, finally, let's take a look at the test and see how well it predicts my results. Finally, let's take the test and see if the algorithm correctly predicts my choices. So the first scenario, we have 2 pedestrians. The first pedestrian is a man and a woman having a calculated VOL of 383.6 and 458.6 respectively, adding up to a total VOL of 842.2. The old man and woman, on the other hand, have a VOL of 343.6 and 348.6 respectively, adding up to 692.2. And yeah, that's what I would have picked too, so that's good. Second is a young passenger versus an old pedestrian. So that would be a VOL of 383.6 plus 100 equals 483.6 versus 343.6 for the elderly man. Again, that's what I would have picked, so doing good so far. So we have 2 pedestrians again, 2 pregnant women, a child, and an old lady. We don't need to factor for the pregnancy since we already took that into account with women. So we would have 2 458.6s and a 348.6 and a 439.6 being 1705.4 versus a 458.6 and a 348.6 being 807.2. I mean, yeah, this one's pretty easy. Obviously, anyone would pick to kill fewer people. I mean, most people would. Next, a male child and a fit female pedestrian versus 2 dogs. 439.6 plus 472.6 equals 912.2 versus 600 for the dogs. Again, yeah, humans over animals. Next, a female executive versus an elderly woman and a man, both being pedestrians. 582.2 versus 383.6 plus 348.6 equals 732.2. So, yeah, we picked the executive woman, which is also what I would have done. Next, 2 passengers being a man and a woman, and a fit man and a woman being pedestrians. So it would be 383.6 plus 458.6 plus 100 equals 942.2 versus 472.6 plus 397.6 equals 870.2. I think I might have over-evaluated how much protecting the passengers meant to me because personally I would have picked the 2 athletes, so 5 out of 6 so far. Next, we have 2 elderly men, a male executive and a male doctor being passengers. So we would have 2 343.6 plus 453.2 plus 1343.6 plus 100 equally 2584. And switching over to the pedestrians, we have 2 elderly women, a female executive, and a female doctor. So 2 348.6s, a 528.2, and a 1418.6. That's 2644. So we would pick the male passenger, and yeah, I agree, marginally as well. So this one was pretty representative of what I would do as well. So far, 6 out of 7. Next, we have 1 girl, 2 women, and a female doctor. So 514.6, 2 458.6s, and a 1418.6 plus 100 for being passengers. That's 2950.4. Versus the male pedestrians with the same qualities, so 439.6, 2 383.6s, and a 1343.6, so that's 2550.6. Yeah, I also would have picked the male pedestrians. Next, we have 2 women, 1 man, and a male executive versus 3 homeless people and a single man, all pedestrians. This is obvious, but let's just go through the algorithm again. The right side will be 2 458.6s, a 383.6, a 453.2, and that's 1754, versus 3 126s plus a 383.6. That's 761.6. And yeah, looking at the numbers, this margin is pretty representative of how I feel. Next, we have 2 male passengers and a female passenger versus 3 homeless people. Again, pretty obvious, but let's go through the numbers. 2 383.6s, a 458.6, and then 100. So that's 1325.8 versus a 378. Yeah, that sounds about right, so we protect the passengers again. Next, we have a female athlete, a male child, and a female child, a large man, and a woman versus a female athlete and a child. And do I really need to do this one? The majority of people win by a long shot. So after looking at this, I realized the female athlete and the child were abiding by the law and the others were not. So for this example, I'm going to treat them as passengers, and yeah, the result isn't drastically different. 472.6, 514.6, 439.6, 369.6, and 458.6. That's 2255 versus 472.6, 524.6, and 100. That's 1087.2. Which, yeah, I don't think crossing the sidewalk at a red light significantly devalues your life. So 10 out of 11, kill the female athlete and the girl, which sounds really bad out of context. Then I got to number 12 and realized, shoot, I forgot to account for the criminal. I'll just flip the sign for the average profession, in which case this is going to be the VOL for the criminal, which is negative 179.6. And the doctor is 1343.6, equaling out to 1164 versus 600 again for the animals. And yeah, I agree, the negative VOL for the criminal doesn't cancel out the doctor's CALIs, so their lives are still worth more than the animals. And finally, a fit male athlete who is a passenger versus an average man who isn't. So 397.6 plus 100 is 497.6 versus 383.6. So kill the pedestrian, and I'm in agreement. We got 12 out of 13 in agreement, which is pretty good. That's an A-. So let's analyze the results and go over the observations and errors. The test prints results and tells me where my morality aligns with the general public. My most safe character was the average female, which, if it were up to me personally, would have been the female doctor. Doctors have the most substantial influence on society, in my opinion, and females are just generally more important for population sustainment. So 8 out of 10. My most killed character was the homeless man, which, if it were up to me, it would have been the criminal, but we only got 13 random situations, so that's okay. 8 out of 10. The system measured that saving more lives meant the most to me, which is accurate, so 10 out of 10. It also said I have a slight preference for passengers, which is also relatively accurate, and we properly control for that in our algorithm, so 9 out of 10. It said I was neutral in upholding the law, which is accurately portrayed in our algorithm, and also something I believe personally in the situation. I don't think crossing a red light significantly devalues your life, so 9 out of 10. It said I slightly didn't care about avoiding intervention, which is also true. In the simulation, I wouldn't mind intervening, so the code did well to represent that, 9 out of 10. It said I have a heavy preference for humans instead of animals, also accurate, and was controlled for in my algorithm, 9 out of 10. Oddly, it said I also have a slight preference for older people versus younger people, and I think I know why. My assumption with this algorithm was that children would grow up to have an average profession, whereas doctors and executives were heavily preferred. I would increase the magnitude of the multiplier on the second algorithm for sure. I definitely value children's lives the most, so 3 out of 10. Results said I have no preference for fit or heavy people. I think we just don't have enough data with only 13 questions to catch the preference in the algorithm, since it was one of the least valued. But the multipliers could have been more significant to probably represent my bias for fit individuals, so overall, I'll give it a 5 out of 10. Finally, it said I heavily valued social standing, which is accurate, so 10 out of 10. So if we were to give results out of 10 and then average those results, we get 8, 8, 10, 9, 9, 9, 3, 5, and 10. We get a 78%, and averaging that with the ratio of times it agreed with me, we get nearly a perfect 85% for this algorithm. So lessons learned. Correct for the law. I do have a slight preference for people that follow the law. Not much, but it's there, and we should have corrected for that. Lesson 2, adjust for the multiplier. I should have increased the multiplier for age since that was my preference. However, that wasn't really represented well within the results. Lesson 3, gather more data. A large part of the inaccuracies in the results could have been because of the few amount of questions. Anyway, that was fun. All right, see ya.